everybody. Stano Smaguego. Igaso Hayan was. Wanishmir Watney. Now it goes. Quite easy. Yeah. Hello, everybody. My name is Ihu Plants. Um, and I said the sun's shining bright today, and we thank the creation for that. This is a project I just did this past summer. That's my band. There's some really excellent artists in this video. They've been a long time collaboration with Derek Miller. I don't know if you know of him much, but we shot all this in my community, and it's a combination of Haudenosaunee and Anishinaabe players, except for one fella who I made another interesting film with that he co-wrote. He's also a musician touring in Europe right now. His name's Hal Gelb, Gelb, and he's an amazing fella. He's been a friend for a long time, and we've done this really interesting film called Quantum Cowboy. It's going to be some distribution on the internet or on the streaming coming up shortly in the next couple of weeks. But the film is unlike anything you've seen before. It uses 22 means of animation, so it's also uses real action, of course, by us actors, but it also animates us 22 different ways to tell this passionate story. It's a bizarre little story. It's a wonderful little movie, and I urge you to check it out when you get a chance, Quantum Cowboy. But the main artist I've collaborated music with for years, his name's Derek Miller. He's from my community. He's one of the most amazing producers, and that young lady in there, her name's Charlie Lowry, and she's a big Tuscarora hit from North Carolina. The Six Nations originally became Six Nations, and we would have been 9 nations had it not been for the American Revolution. The Wyandots, the Tudelos, and the Delaware were to join the Confederacy at the time. It makes me think about this world had the newcomers, the settlers, would have kind of just accepted us as who we were, and we could have blossomed together as nations. It would have been a really interesting thing. And it leads me to think even, they used our method of peaceful coexistence among all those tribal people in the Constitution of the United States, except women selected leadership in our community and still do. The clan mothers are the ones that select the ones that will lead. And if you look at the American system, they replaced the clan mothers with the Electoral College. You can imagine if women selected leadership in this country, what a difference we would make in this land. I think we're working back because we are a maternal culture, Indigenous people for the most part. Women place a much stronger role in our society than they have in the American dream. And they've been excluded, and Ben Franklin and all those fellas knew that when they made that Constitution, that they were excluding the women. So there's still work to be done in the future generations to know that and to move toward that women must be more present in society. It's been a wonderful life. I never would have thought I would have become an actor. I was this big man set to be a football hero because I could carry 5 men on my back when I was a young person playing football. And I was just telling this story earlier. I found a way because I knew that football as a life, in order to be good, you had to hurt somebody, it seemed. And because I was so large, I was always ended up on the line, and I had scholarships to go to college, and I turned them all down. In fact, I stopped playing football in high school, and I had picked up a course in photography in a senior year of high school, and it really changed my life. It's one of the reasons why this film's in black and white, I suppose. It was a much simpler time with photography. It's all digitized now. It's all been changed. But it really taught me about light and image and, the power of I remember as a young person taking pictures of trees all the time, and I couldn't figure out why I was so attracted to trees in general. But as I grew older, and I didn't get a lot of cultural training as a young person because I was urbanized, right? I was if you've seen the film Dead Man, which is a worthy look at by a well-known director named best independent director in the country named Jim Jarmusch. He's made really wonderful films in his career. He's probably my age now and still making movies, but Dead Man is well worth a look at. But it really represented my childhood in a way, being stripped from my culture and urbanized in Buffalo, New York, of all places. And, kind of had to relearn my identity and my place in my Haudenosaunee culture on my own. I managed to get back to my language in my early years of acting and did an adult immersion course. There's another wonderful film of a young lady that studied the same language I did, which is Cayuga language or Gayacono, we call it. And she made a film called Fancy Dance. And, we're hopefully to show it here through this same organization, possibly this year. It's, it's a film that kind of deals with the murdered and missing women issue, which is big for us in the Indian country, throughout America and Canada. And a lot of the man camps that mainly the oil industry and other extractive industries have caused a lot of pain in our communities the last many years. But she took our language and adapted it into this beautiful film, mother-daughter auntie story, and it's one of the more powerful films I've seen this year. Fancy Dance. You ought to see if you can find that. It's still, again, with Indigenous film, it's still struggling to find distribution in this world of streaming and such, and it's always a challenge for our filmmakers to make enough economy from the projects they're doing to create other films. And so I did want to share a little later with you this morning a project that I've been working on, which is called Hempire, um, which is like Empire, only Hempire, and creating a new economy vis-a-vis hemp, which I see as a very valuable plant. It's a plant of power that has been done this amazing public relations job. You probably all remember the simple film Reefer Madness, where they began this public relations scheme against the plant, and it undermined our efforts as Indigenous people because we've been living and using that plant for centuries of time. 20,000 years, that plant has been a service to our community, very similar to corn, and in the value. Like my whole religion, I suppose, if you could refer to that, my culture is based around the plant of corn. You know, the word in our language, when you peel a corn stalk from the corn, is the same word as a child being born, right? And if you follow the cycle of corn and its growth throughout the year, that's the exact ceremonial calendar for much of Native America and Central American Native people, where Mexico was the Mayan are the ones that developed that corn from a grass into a viable, changed the economics of the world. Corn did. And so a lot of the plant cultures have been kind of suppressed or oppressed, much like Indigenous people have in this planet, to create this new economy that they wanted, which was cotton, which is probably the second most environmentally damaging issue that we're facing. Clothing's a big impact. All the clothing we wear, all the nylon, rayons, etc., all based from oil and gas. Much of that we can't continue. It's not self-sustaining. We can't continue that economic way of life by maintaining this way. Same with pulp and paper. We can't continue to cut trees for paper when we can make it. In fact, the Constitution is on hemp paper. So hemp has been, kind of suppressed to create these new economies. Same with oil and gas. Uh, the chemical industry, which I grew up with in Niagara Falls. My family were all industrial workers, and I remember, taking my father to the Hooker chemical plant as a child, and the sky was, orange from all the sulfur. And I hadn't seen anything like that until you go to India. If you ever manage your way to India, you can't even see the sun in New Delhi because of the pollution from basically they're still running diesel fuel over there and all those other old school chemicals that are creating pollution at a level we've not even experienced here. But uh, so the automotive industries, all of these industries have been created, which you've all been a big part of here in Ohio, could be completely adapted through hemp. I mean, hemp is stronger than steel, stronger than fiberglass. We can build auto bodies from it. We can build batteries from hemp. We don't need to exploit minerals in the earth to create, lithium for our phones that we all use daily. There's so much thought that needs to go into it as in terms of young people and educating themselves to the potential of kind of strategizing our future and create a new economy at the same time. We seem kind of locked into this economy of destruction in a way that we're dealing with all this cancer. I mean, how many people in this room have dealt with cancer in the last 20 years, right? Most of that's from the environmental degradation that we've suffered since they kind of outlawed hemp and cannabis. And so I see hemp as a method to get back to the earth, right? Create more agronomy. I mean, now we're feeding cow corn, soybeans to our cattle. Um, you use fertilizers and chemicals to make all that food, and so that's where the cancer's coming from. All the food we're eating. We're eating far too much beef, right? The beef is destroying the earth. They're cutting trees down in Central America and South America consistently, and here in North America as well to graze cattle. They're chasing wild animals down like horses in Western America to so that cattle can graze. And the cattle grazing on land is a lot harder than natural animals like antelope and deer and wild horses. They're much softer on the climate and on the environment, on the lands than raising cattle. So there's a lot of things we need to be made aware of, but a lot of the time the society won't make you aware of that because they're in control of everything, right? In terms of all the imagery we see. And I spent a lot of time as an actor. I did beyond my efforts, the 100 films that were talked about. Much of my work went into organizing and developing institutions that could help make this change. For instance, I established and helped to establish, won the license through the CRTC, which is like the FCC here in the States, the Federal Communications Commission, where all the broadcasters have to go for licensing. And there's a simple change in Canada that they did that 4% of every private broadcaster's budget has to go to public good to, encourage artists or to promote artists is what they've used it for the most part, musical artists, so they can continue to create, new content like I just did on my recent tour to my home community. I did 12 shows in Ontario this past summer in July, and that's when we produced this video. For those of interest, I've been trying to encourage public radio support for Native people in this community, right? Because, Ohio's classically an Indian state, right? I mean, there was Indians all over this state for centuries. 10,000 years, there's been indigenous people on this land, but we've literally kind of just erased them here in Ohio. I think we've got a lot of work to do to bring those nations back to strength and to encourage that by using mediums like radio, public radio. I know we have a public radio station, we have a public television station here today. And a lot of those public stations should be offering music and culture through those radio stations that specifically promote Native America to you. Because in a way, when you think of it, you're all part of Native America. You've come to this land, you've fostered and lived here for centuries of time now, and it's time to realize who you are, where you come from. These lands were all based on indigenous culture, and I think there's a way to find our way back to it. I think it's almost necessity now, as we can see our earth starting to crumble from all the wars and all the extraction just continually, and it's not gonna be able to allow us to continue. Our children's children might not have a future if we don't start becoming more aware of who we are and where we're from and where we're going, right? Like this place should last forever, not have like an end to it. So much of my work, besides being the actor, and I was always conscious of this, choosing to be an actor because I really wanted to change the world. I wanted to make it a better place for everybody, especially my indigenous people, which have suffered for centuries of time. Makes me cry to even think of it, to even speak of it. So I helped to start the Aboriginal People's Television Network in Canada. It goes right across the country, just like CBC, CTV. It's in every hotel you stay in Canada, and it's all there. It's all produced by Indigenous people telling our stories. And it took a few years to make that happen. We did it around the turn of the century. I was telling a student here earlier, at the time when we did that, there must have been maybe only a handful of producers and directors in our community nationwide in Canada at the time. And now, 23 years later, there's hundreds of producers making content. And you can start to see that impact. Now there's a new series coming out on PBS called, does anyone know? It's all about the residential school and the impact and the 60s scoop of when they took children from Indian families and flushed them over to Europe and flushed them down into the States here. There was a lot of abuse and stories that come from that. But there's a Little Bird. There's a new series coming on PBS very shortly, upcoming, and you'll see a lot of that story told finally. But those are all 23 years later of creating these producers and directors, and now, in a way, that's where Reservation Dogs came from. All that work we've been doing for the last 50 years to kind of nurture Native America to come back to life and to be a vibrant part of the larger society. So it's been a lot of work to mastermind all this, and I certainly didn't do it alone. Don't let me talk you into believing that. It's just the body politic and the vision, we had is a community to really take the bull by the horns, as it were, and not sit back and watch our world disintegrate before us. We're going to be active in the years to come. You'll see more and more Indigenous content in the world as we progress, and that's around the world. Because Indigenous people in America and Canada and Mexico, we're connected to Indigenous people around the world, right? There's Indigenous societies around the world, and we're all connected. And we've been talking for years and developing concepts for television networks, for radio networks. But I did want to make a small plug for this particular song, is hit the charts. And there is a chart for Indigenous music. Many of you may not even know it. It's called the Indigenous Music Countdown. It's based out of Winnipeg, Manitoba. Anyone interested to program our music in a show here in Dayton, Ohio, you're welcome to go to indigenousmusiccountdown.com, and you can see a top 40 list every week, and it's prolific. It really is prolific. There's 40 new songs practically every week, and they rise into the charts, and it allows them to prosper in their careers to create more music. My family was very involved with this shoot. That's my sister, 8 years younger than me. there's only the two of us. She's a dance teacher in my res. She teaches jazz, tap, ballet, hip hop, you name it. She's been teaching dance for as long as I've been an actor. My 14-year-old sister started teaching dance in my community, and it's had a profound effect. Even something simple as jazz, tap, and ballet. It's allowed the children to gain a certain sense of self-confidence about themselves. And it's really helped nurture a lot of youth in our community for the last 50 years. So we've both been pretty powerhouse in terms of our community and its reflection and our participation in getting our young people into the arts and getting them to learn how to express themselves. And that's what it's been all about.
Hello, thank you for coming and for showing that beautiful piece. I'm wondering if there's anyone in the Native community that's producing hemp on a large scale, perhaps to be used in paper products. And also, are there any websites where we can get more information for perhaps like indigenous manufacturing, to where companies could procure items produced by the indigenous community?
Well, you have to realize that hemp has only been allowed to be grown in the United States since the Farm Bill in 2018. So it's a real fledgling industry. There are large farms in hundreds to the thousands of acres, primarily taking place in Wisconsin, Michigan, Kansas is a big proliferator of that. The big thing facing us right now is allowing hemp to be feed for cattle and for livestock so that we don't have to use chemicals to make cow corn and soybeans, which is basically the main crop of America right now is soybeans and cultivated cow corn. So it's a fledgling industry. There are larger operations. There's more operations working in cannabis right now because, as you can see, that's a profit margin. Perfect example is Colorado. They've managed to really create a whole new tax incentive from selling marijuana. So it's a sister crop. So that's the boom industry right now. But now they're going to allow large corporations to start growing cannabis, and that's going to change the whole small farmer agronomy. So yeah, it's a real fledgling industry, and especially here in the States because of the laws that have kept the plant down for so long. So there are, with some research, a lot of information out there in terms of products that are being currently produced with the plant, and of course, my series hopes to explore, all of those regions of diaspora in the future to continue to create a series that people can enjoy and learn from, and possibly start changing some of the agronomy practices that currently exist in the U.S. and Canada. Yeah.
Listening to your music, I hear a lot of sounds that I heard when I visited New Orleans. And I just wanted to know, where do you get your inspiration from your sound for your band?
I always credit it with, when the slaves were first brought here, they used our crop. Corn allowed Europe to enslave Africa. And when Africa came to the United States, basically down in South Carolina, I guess it is. The town slips me by name, but I've actually been there. There's no recognition, by the way, of the slave trade and how, enslaving Africa allowed us to prosper as new people on this continent. But when they came, our people were in the fields on the eastern shore still, 1760s or so, 1740. And I always believe that combination of the black drum and the Indian drum came together at that point. Um, Tuscaroras are part of my heritage. My grandmother was Tuscarora, and Tuscaroras were in the Carolinas at the time of slavery came. And I believe that that amalgamation of those two drums, to me, that's probably the biggest story yet untold in our cultural understanding, is that history of Black and Native America coming together, and that relationship that we had over centuries of time. In fact, the Tuscarora Trail later, which was the route that the Tuscaroras took from the Carolinas after Washington warred on them for 10 years. It's called the 10-Year War back in 1712. That route that the Tuscaroras took to the north to join our confederacy, the Six Nations, and we became the Iroquois Confederacy of Six Nations, is the same Underground Railroad that the Blacks used to come to the north in that period. So that relationship between Native America and Black America is somewhat intrinsic, and much of those stories have yet to be told cinematically, dramatically, even documentaries. There's not been much attention paid to that relationship, and I believe that that's, that combination brought forth my flavor of music, which is, I suppose, I just won an award in New Mexico for music in the Americana section, but I've also won music awards for blues and rock genres as well. So I don't feel that I feel like my music's kind of genreless, but that I truly believe that's the impact because all the players in my community kind of basically play blues music, and it's been a big impact in our community for a long time. Yeah. Thank you for that question. Yeah. Yeah, she asked how hard is it to get into areas of performance, whether it be casting and such. I think because of the proliferation of Native representation in the media, many people are attracted to becoming like actors all of a sudden, and it's a bit of a process. I learned specifically by participating with the theater. The theater community is a really vibrant community. It's really a writer's medium. You can look at television as a producer's medium. You can look at film as more of a director's medium. And the way I came into it was quite sincerely through developing local plays within Native communities. I have a methodology where I ask a couple of questions of students. I ask them if there was one thing in the world you would change, what would it be? And I ask, what's the funniest or most embarrassing moment in your life? I ask those two questions. I collect all the answers. If you collect those answers, generally you'll find there's a few that are common. Somebody might like to say, I'd like to stave off starvation, people not having enough food to sustain. Somebody might say, the time I rode on a train and my cat peed on me and I smelled like pee all day. So I take those and I help them weave into a story, which gives them a kind of an identity. It gives them it's their stories that they're telling. So I find that's the best way for Native America to tell their own story within the context of their own community, and you build that exercise within storytelling, which is long time our way of transmission. All of our cultures are based on oral tradition, so it's kind of a natural extension of that. And so then you start feeding those stories back to your community, and you'll get rebounds or reflection from that experience, and they'll learn, and it can help the community nurture itself in a positive way without in Native communities, to be honest, there's a lot of bickering amongst politics in our tribal systems. And if we applied artistic nature to storytelling to try and resolve some of the simple differences between traditional and non-traditional, educated and non, so those stories we can weave into tales that help our community see the bigger picture. At the same time, it fosters that development of that storyteller to the point. So that's the best answer I like to give. Start based in your community with the young people and find a methodology to help them tell the stories that are your stories, right? And then from that part, as they get a little bit more sophisticated, they can start entering that field of finding an agent and wanting to but maybe we can take then that theatrical story that we did live as a theater piece, and we can translate it and redo it for television or redo it for film, and you start nurturing that storytelling tradition to a different medium. Then it's a different approach because you need more people to theatrically. It's very simple. When you get to television, you need more assistance with technology and lights and sound and cameras and profit. You need money then. With theatrical experience, you don't need money. It's all people power. And you need a venue, but you can use the community hall. You can use any venue. You can go outside and create a forest theater, where you tell stories that are, based around nature and explained in nature and told in nature. So that's some of the more creative ways. But these days, any young person, because the medium is moving so fast, it's just a matter of getting some experience anywhere you can. And theatrically is probably the best way, because I find that young people don't learn to act in film. You got to have some skills prior to going to cinema. Now, some people have a natural way to it, and it's just trying to stay natural with it and be yourself is the best, most honest way. But I hope that's a good answer. You're welcome. Yeah. Anything else? All right, there's a fellow there. You want a microphone there? There we go.
So I only caught the tail end of your presentation. So if you talked about this before, I'm sorry, but I was curious about with the new prominent rise of a lot of indigenous stories being told in television and film. I was wondering if, in your perspective, there's a difference in appetite between those two mediums for indigenous actors, stories, lead writers, directors, indigenous presence in television versus film. Do you see any difference there?
Well, television is probably since it got streamed, since television started to stream, before it was only network television, there's a lot of censorship there. What streaming has allowed is the censorship to fall away. So storytelling, it was all of a sudden opened up to everybody, where when NBC, CBS, ABC controlled everything, it was very from kind of, American centric. I used to joke, I'm sick of living in an American bedroom for storytelling and cinema. Streaming has allowed the world to open up bigger, so any community can access streaming television, streaming series, can create series. There's a lot more, even with the recent strikes of the Writers Guild and the Actors Guild, been interested to kind of diversify the overall picture of our planet, because it's obviously a very diversified planet, especially in America, with all the immigration, consistent immigration for 200, 300 years. So it's always a changing picture that way. So, commercial television, even though it's streaming now, has really opened up the opportunities for all races of man, more so than it ever has in previous controls. but also the ownership of networks like the Aboriginal People's Television Network in the United States. There's some fledgling networks in certain nations, like Cherokee has its own television network. Assiniboine has their own television network down in Oklahoma. The FNX experience, which is on most cable systems, First Nations experience. It's FNX on my channel. It's 363. Is owned by the San Bernardino tribe down in Southern California, and they're slowly edging their way into. There, you can watch a lot of native, old school television about, living with plants and living in the forests. Living in the north and Inuit and Nuktatuk and on all of those language come forward over that network. So it's still a bustling industry potentially. And I always thought that the casino culture that we've been kind of limited to created enough economy so that we can start to apply it to the creative arts more, to have more impact instead of just taking your money from you at the casino, that we can actually entertain you with our lives and the rich storytelling tradition that we have in our communities. So things have changed a lot in the last 10 years, and it's better than ever for people like myself in a way. I'm ending on a happy note after 70 years. Yes, question right there.
Thank you for being here. I was wondering if there is a way that you can share how we can support your efforts to produce Empire.
I don't have a methodology. The thing that you can search, though, I became the ambassador of the Indigenous Cannabis Industry Association, and that's just indigenouscannabis.org or .com. I'm not sure. And that's a nonprofit organization, and we're doing all the work in Washington, trying to get bills through Congress. We're trying to unify all the efforts in the indigenous community who are working both in cannabis and hemp on the same page, dealing with specifically issues like testing, which we're having issues in our community, because as you know, Canada, the whole country is allowed cannabis to be retailed to people. And testing's become a big issue for us because we're finding things in the cannabis that shouldn't be there, like prescription drugs that are causing addictive nature. They're being tossed in there. So there's a lot of issues in this fledgling business of cannabis and hemp. And so the Indigenous Cannabis Industry Association is only 2 years old, but you can stay in touch with us there and you can see all of our efforts that we're doing with governance and all the scientific side of things. The amount of research that we're doing in dealing with cancer using hemp and CBD is amazing. How that, we're going to do a program specifically on dealing with that as it applies to cancer. And then there's a whole other system you can explore. I was telling a friend here, there's a sixth system in our bodies that exists. It's called the endocannabinoid system. You can search that through YouTube, endocannabinoid. Besides the nervous system and the skeletal system, we have an endocannabinoid system within us that's existed for time immemorial. It seems that the medical profession has downplayed that system for centuries of time, often because we're so caught up in this prescription drug world, right? And that's the reason why they've that's another reason to outlaw hemp back in those days, and cannabis was specifically so that the pharmaceutical industry and its profits has skyrocketed, and we can see the impact of that industry on our youth, especially when they get caught up in so many of those drugs that you can't recover from, and many lives are destroyed. So there's a lot of learning to do within our cultures to kind of make things better for the general populace, and we're at the forefront of that, I think, with the indigenous communities. Of course, we're always looking for a way to find industries of economic development for ourselves. And that's certainly one track that we're finding could be beneficial to not only ourselves, but to the world. So. Right, another question there, yeah. Like guys.
Okay. I just wanted to thank you. I feel like you've really inspired me today and you have my wheels turning. I work for a company that's global and they're a manufacturer of labels and tags. And our customers are in the retail, food, and logistics space. And I know there's a growing desire for sustainable materials, and more people are customers are interested in sustainability and recycled products. And I just think about how we make all these paper products. And I'm not in our sustainability department, but it starts to make me think about our manufacturing processes and who are we working with that are producing these items, and could we potentially, I kind of work in procurement a little bit, so I'm just thinking of all these avenues of who could we work with to procure these materials to like make, sustainable labels and tags that are being used in these, global huge companies. So just thank you for the inspiration.
You bet. I mean, it's a long time we get rid of the pulp and paper industry. It's causing a lot of issues, and you don't see it if you don't have a pulp and paper mill near you. But it creates a phenomenal amount of waste, chlorine into the water, high incidences. 50% of Indigenous women in Northern Ontario have cancer because there's a pulp and paper mill every 100 miles. So it's a travesty business, and it should be outlawed. And I can't help but ask, when are the industries going to be held responsible for all the damage they've done to the earth, right? When are we going to look at them and say, come on, you got to buck up. You either got to change or you got to pay big taxes for the amount of affluence you've caused us and pain and suffering with all the medical issues we face. So yeah, there's a lot of work to be done, and you're on the right track. Thank you so much for that. Yeah. Right. Good. You guys have been great. We're planning, hopefully, to have a Native American Film Festival launched here in Dayton. I think it's a fine way to introduce you to our people throughout the continent, and bringing films to Dayton and the library and other venues in town to really begin to showcase some of the work we're doing and some positive things happening within our community. So thank you for being here today. It's a nice audience. Oh.
Well, my name is Robert Kansas, and we're here today at the Dayton Metro Library in Dayton, Ohio. And I have the honor of interviewing Gary Farmer.
Yeah. Yes, Kanos Wagwego, Negaso Hayat was when he's real with me. That goes quite easy. That's my Cayuga language. I'm from the Six Nations along the Grand River in Ontario, Canada. It's a Haudenosaunee, or often referred to as Iroquois community. And there's about 17 communities throughout, the United States, Canada, and all the way down to Oklahoma. So there was a big, we covered a wide tract of land, Finger Lakes, of course, and all down through the Ohio Valley and into the, and down into Oklahoma. It was mainly our trading routes. Just over here and outside Cincinnati, they found some mounds of our Cayuga and Seneca family there from 10,000 years ago. So we've obviously been here for a long time. So it's nice to be here with you. Hyan Twist, that's my name. They call me, and it's it's a simple name, literally a translation of my last name, He Who Plants. But it's a common name given prior to a ceremonial name given. I've yet to go to Big Corn and get my ceremonial name, but that's some work I got to do yet. So.
Okay. Well, based on my short introduction to you and your journey and your history. It seems to be an appropriate translation. He who plants is
He
that.
who plants. Yeah. Well, I always think of it as like planting ideas too. I've always been somewhat ahead of my time, I guess. Always looking to the future. I don't know, for continued existence on the planet. That's my objective.
Would you share with us? You're a native of Canada, and
Well, the Haudenosaunee are on both sides of the border. We pre-exist the border.
oh,
The borders. I
Certainly.
mean, these countries are pretty young, right? Both Canada
yes,
and the U.S.
yes.
I mean, we're talking 10,000 years. My society has been here, and Canada and the United States are just a couple hundred years old, maybe 250 now.
I-
But what happened was that half of my people, after being warred on, sided with the British and fought against the Americans. To me, we're the only reason that Canada exists, because we were like the Viet Cong, right? We were used to fighting or having to battle in the forest, and the British were still marching up and down, and, pretty straight people. But so we were the forest fighters, and I feel like we won Canada for Canada. And they gave us a tract of land for helping them in those wars, both, the American Revolution, and also the War of 1812 is where the line came from between the two countries. So half of my people are still here in the States.
Okay.
So they say our traditional fires split in two at that time. And it was the first time ever that we ever fought amongst each other, where the Oneidas and Cayugas and Senecas were sided with the U.S. And half of us, led by a guy named Joseph Brant, fought with the British against the Americans. So we're the only reason that Canada exists, I always felt and said and promoted. We're fighting back for our land. We got 6 miles each side of this river called the Grand River, from the mouth to the source. It's about a 150-mile river, but we're down to 25,000 square acres. So
Oh,
we're only about 10 miles deep on our res. So the land's a big issue for us, and there's a big settlement in Canada. Finally, after 200 years, they're bringing us forth to the top courts in Canada. So we're expecting some kind of remuneration or some kind of settlement. I doubt. We got a little bit of land back, but not much. So looking forward to that. It should happen in 24. Interesting case to follow, but that's how that history broke down. So, and the relationship between us, Haudenosaunee, on both sides of the border is really close. Like that was just an incident back then, but we've, our families intermingle. We still have socials and events that go around our culture in terms of something like a sing, where tribal community members come up with new traditional sounds, new music,
okay.
and we share that with other communities. Most of our Haudenosaunee communities, there's probably 5 or 6 around Buffalo, in and around Western New York, all the way out to Onondaga, which is over in Syracuse, and of course down into Oklahoma. Oneida's over in Wisconsin by Green Bay, and Mohawks up by Montreal and up to St. Lawrence. Mohawks in central Ontario, Gibson Reserve, famous for cranberry growth. So that's where the cranberries come from. This is my people.
Well, it's intriguing that music is part of that knitting together.
Yeah, especially our traditional songs they create out of our language. Our outward presentations are more social songs. Our inward ceremonial songs are only done within the longhouse.
Okay.
And the longhouse, from my uncle's teaching, is the sky above and the ground below, and everything in between is my home. So,
Wow.
but the Quakers did manage to kind of squash us into a building. They call it Longhouse now in communities, and we still celebrate our culture there. Probably about 10 to 12 ceremonies a year.
Wow.
We celebrate maple syrup, strawberries, green corn, big corn. Of course, Day of the Dead almost. Other ceremonies around most of our ceremonies around, things that we live from, foods and sources like that. So
Well, I'm thankful for the clarification, the richness
yeah,
that you are bringing
yeah, it's very
in
rich.
this conversation.
And it's not necessarily our ceremonial life is not open to anyone else but our
Right, your
membership.
your-
So
people.
social, that's why the social dances play such a big role as a presentation to people outside our community.
Okay.
But we celebrate them at the powwows and stuff too.
Hey,
Social dancing, big dances, the stomp dance, almost like from Oklahoma. And we also do a fast dance, very competitive.
well, I'm intrigued with both how you've woven in the traditional indigenous history within your vocation or career.
Yeah, for sure. Well, I always represented, even though they said more times than one that I didn't look Native American. I used to get that. I grew up with mostly an immigrant community of Irish, Italians, and Polish. And I tried to socialize them, but it was challenging. They faced, but what was interesting is when they started to integrate and bus the black students into white communities. In my high school, that's what they did in Buffalo. And that was really interesting because I got along with everybody. I was almost like the go-between between the black community and the white community as a young person. And, I always, they're indigenous people too, if you think of it, from Africa, right? They come from indigenous societies. So I always like to promote black culture and stuff too when I'm presenting, because I feel like we're connected, but we really haven't explored that relationship a lot in history. Although we have in historical terms, but not contemporarily. They seem like two distinct peoples. Well, they are. But how they cross parallel in the history of America is a fascinating story.
Certainly.
Yeah.
Coming back to your early days in school and perhaps exploring this, and I find it very intriguing that apparently you were in sports to some degree.
Yeah, I was a good athlete. I could have been. I just chose a different direction because it wasn't serving my ultimatum, I suppose. I always had to represent because I was the only Native in my class. And so I always had to, whenever they got to the Native section of the history, which wasn't too often, I became the spokesperson.
Oh.
And then I grew up with political knowledge about our rights, even in terms of the border. There's a treaty called the John Jay Treaty from 1794, 1796, which allowed us natives in Canada to come live here in the States, retire, work. And that treaty was kind of embedded in me as a child. And every year still, we celebrate that treaty by parading from Niagara Falls, Ontario to Niagara Falls, New York. And then the next year, we celebrate and parade from Niagara Falls, New York to Niagara Falls, Ontario to celebrate that treaty. And as a child, all the Shawnee that remained in Ohio used to come to that celebration and parade with us every year to celebrate that treaty. And I always wondered about them. I knew they were from Ohio, but they always had a really fancy marching band. Like they had they had like really nice outfits with like almost like a powwow fringe, and they were well dressed and had nice little, and they played horns and drums, and so they were really the big band in our representation or our honoring of this treaty that allowed me the rights to the states.
Wow.
So that was an interesting period in my youth, and I grew up partially in Niagara Falls, New York. And
Okay.
my father and a lot of my family built that power project and all that mega chemical industry that was nurtured there, steel industry. That was my family's. My grandfather dug the hole for Love Canal, which they just, put a bunch of
Yes.
pollutants they
Toxic.
didn't know what to do with at the time and capped it, and then they threw earth on it and built houses on it until it all started to leach, and they eventually closed it off. I think you can still buy a home there for $5,000, but I'm sure it'll affect your health long term. But yeah, that always my grandfather, the one who dug that hole, he was such a gentle man, and I always, and yet they were very political about our rights, but they weren't so active with our culture. A lot of our community got divided by Christianity, and so that really was challenging for us to deal with. Still today, it divides us in a lot of ways. The traditionals and the Christians, in a way.
Yes, sir.
So that's been an interesting. Now, a lot of the Christians don't participate in our cultural ways. They became legitimate, Bible thumpers.
Yes, I understand the challenge and the
Yeah, it created quite a challenge. And then the residential school system. We had one literally 12 miles, which was actually on our traditional territory, but they built a residential school there called the Mush Hole back around 1850. And a lot of our people were there, and they pulled natives from all over Canada there as well, up until 1970 or so. So that was a big impact too. There's some cinema out about those stories now, just starting to be told by our own people, those years of residential school.
As I sit and listen, I begin to see there is much that is not known.
Yeah, they didn't tell you any of that in school. Basically, America took it like our native history was, that we were defeated by them. And I can understand why they did that, because they had to have their loyalty, pledge allegiance to the flag, all that stuff, back when we used to have to do that. So, that's how they kind of took the territory and basically educated their children that it was rightfully theirs, that no one else was here. And that's the education 95% of Americans received. And so for me as a performer, that's been my battle, to try and help them understand that that's not the story. That's not how it goes. And we never did give way. We accepted you, the newcomers. We agreed to share. And we have treaties specifically about it. The main one is wampum. People think and confuse it with the ideology of money, but it had nothing to do with money. It was our way to set a treaty. And the main treaty for us with America was called the two-row wampum, which meant there was two purple beaded out of shell beads in going in one direction, and there were three white rows between those two purple ones. One purple one represented the newcomers, the settlers, and the other was us. And we were allowing you to share the land, and you maintain your integrity, your way of life in your ship, and us in our canoe, we maintain our integrity, our way of life. But they, of course, with the residential schools and the taking of lands and exploitation of our lands, they crossed over that, and they didn't respect that two-row wampum. But that's a legitimate thing that we often try to pitch to the Dutch, who were literally one of the first that we negotiated that treaty with. And the Haudenosaunee, or the Iroquois, were the ones that kind of helped to distribute those lands early in that negotiation, but that got corrupted pretty fast. And in fact, a great story is a guy named, they wouldn't let him be a doctor. He wanted to be a medical doctor. He was a Seneca. His name's slipping me by hand. They wouldn't let him be a doctor, so he went and educated himself to be an engineer. And he used to build bridges and things like that. And he was in the, met one of the presidents who was during the Civil War, which would have been, who would that have been? Not Garfield, but anyway, he won the election for president. He was the president of the United States, and he made the Seneca the first minister of the Department of Indian Affairs. And at the time, they were trying to get rid of the Lakotas, Dakotas in South Dakota, and basically were starving them out. And the food that was to be supplied for them, which was basically white flour, white sugar, white death, really, was being interrupted by the black market. And he went out there to try and resolve that. And while he was out there, the president who resolved the war at the time cut his ties with him and left them to float. And because he was, trying to help the South Dakota tribes with the food and make sure that they weren't starving them out, but that was their intention. And so the history got dark from then. But it's funny that this Seneca man, whose name I can't seem to remember at this point, he was the only one who could read or write English between the two warring generals in the Civil War. And he wrote the peace accord that brought the North and South together again. Ely Parker was his name. And he's quite an interesting character in American history. And he eventually came home, but he learned a lot of ways and ended up in New York City and trying to exploit the stock market. He married a wealthy woman and got caught up in that. And then after they all went broke, he came home back to the people. So Ely Parker is kind of they did PBS did a documentary on him. I'm not sure if it was a documentary, on him several years ago. Wes Studi, the actor, my friend, played him in the film. But yeah, there's a fascinating history of unknown history that most Americans are familiar with. So I've always taken that as my role to try and re-educate the people a bit about what really happened.
Well, it sounds like you, and I don't want to put a cliche because sincerely, it seems that what you are doing is planting these seeds,
Yeah.
beginning these efforts, and hope through a period of time they will mature, grow, and thrive.
Yeah, because I believe indigenous people have so much to offer the world. Like, because now that we can see the environment disintegrating, and we're in this time of weather, climate crisis, that knowledge is so valuable to survival on the planet. And so that's been my effort to try and turn that around. It's a big job. It's been a lifetime of work, 50 years of speaking this way, acting this way, taking stories on that meant a lot to me to tell, to try and re-educate Americans to who they really are and where they really come from. And have respect for the indigenous peoples that were throughout this continent. And, you know, all of our relations are in Central and South America. We used to speak about the eagle and the flight of the eagle. If you follow the flight of the eagle, he goes right into Central America. And the condor, all the traditional peoples of Central and South America, that's how those trading routes came. We followed that flight of that eagle, and that led us to the corn, to the, the Zuni Pueblos had 200 varieties of bean when the Spanish first came. 200 varieties of beans. So we shared so much of that food to the new coming people, and even fed the Irish during the potato famine in the 1800s, and they still recognize that for us. I just watched the Irish Prime Minister fight for the Palestinians and decide they're going to, chase Israel off, the representatives out of their government. And I thought that was really interesting, because we look at the Palestinians as kind of indigenous people,
Certainly,
And,
certainly.
there's been a lot of confusion around that. I remember taking a film to the Cannes Film Festival. It's a big festival in France, Cannes, France. I remember an Israeli journalist wanting to interview me about, Native America and what America's done to the people. And I said, well, it's kind of similar to your story with Palestinians. And he got really, really angry. And he chased me around. I was only there for 3 or 4 days. But all my time there, he would find me and he would scream out at me. And I thought, wow, geez, the journalists aren't that objective. You're supposed to have a certain sense of objectivity when you're a journalist. But they didn't. They got this deep hatred. And it's being still today. It's hard to believe what they're doing. But it's still proliferating. And America seems so supportive. And I'm just not sure why. I have a hard time understanding their support of modern day genocide, just like we suffered.
Well,
There's so much knowledge to be shared with general population. They just got in the dark about things, and then they just focus on their economic survival, and America's kind of forced them to do that. They continue on with these jobs that just exploit the earth and no knowledge of where we live and the planet we live on, and the benefits it gives us, how it feeds us, and so gives us water and nutrient. And I don't know, I have a hard time at my age understanding why it's been so hard to get to this point.
I share a similar sort of frustration, disappointment,
Yeah.
sorrow. And I want to ask, I just came across the doctrine of discovery.
Yeah, I'm working on a film with that. I've been helping with the producing side of examining that whole effort when they said, the church, if they're not Christians, you can take their land, you can kill them, you can, whatever they got, you can take. And To even have the Pope say that was a bad idea this last year, after 500 years of this, is a step in the right direction, but it's a hard look back at our history. 500 years, people feel unconnected to that history, but yet, when you realize the impact that had on indigenous people around the world, it's saddening. It's hard to accept.
And part of what I have experienced in my limited understanding is that now some of the scientific endeavors are looking to nature for some of the answers.
That's where the answers are.
I scratch my head and say,
Yeah.
what? That wasn't thought of before.
There's this wonderful doctor of education. His name is, I think he's at the University of Alberta in Lethbridge. He used to bring, 20 years ago, he brought top scientists and indigenous leadership together on this annual discussion. So, and how much he helped to socialize a lot of the leading climate change activists now to really look at that relationship and understand, how it really works. Because I always say that our indigenous languages are the true study of nature based on observation of time over centuries.
Yeah.
And that knowledge, to me, is precious. So we work hard at maintaining the indigenous languages that are still Mohawk and Cayuga are in good shape. Onondaga is doing pretty good. Tuscarora language, because of that separation, there's still communities down in the Carolinas, and there's a community in Niagara Falls, Tuscarora, and a lot of them sided with us during that split. So that language is suffering because of all that, change of environment, and the language wasn't necessarily. So we worry about certain languages, and we work hard to try and maintain them and get them back to health. Even our own language, back in my day when I first started getting really into broadcasting, because I saw, this is how we can socialize our neighbors so they won't hate on us for being Indians. They can understand their own history and how they came to be here. We only had 8 speakers over the age of 40 for any one of our languages. So the last 25 years has been hard work for our communities to maintain those languages. It needs more support than it's getting, but we've done it pretty well on our own to maintain those languages. And some languages in indigenous cultures, like Dene or Navajo, is strong. Cherokee's still got a strong amount of speakers, but a lot of indigenous languages in smaller, isolated communities like Miccosukee in Central Florida, they struggle to maintain their integrity of their culture and language. And they were isolated. So yeah, it's an ongoing struggle for indigenous people to bring their languages back to strength and maintain that integrity of knowledge within the young. So that's where we share it. We have schools now in my community in Ontario where a child can go to school from kindergarten all the way to grade 12 in our own languages.
Oh, wow.
And a lot of people are worried about that because then they won't have some of those advantages of English in the business world. So there's that struggle too, trying to maintain a balance between survival and maintaining our cultural integrity. And those are some of the conflicts within our own nation.
Well, what I am enlightened by in this conversation is the richness of perspective in observation and these tribal languages all have different perspectives,
Mhm.
but give a deeper understanding to the observation.
Yeah, like
And
medicine.
yeah,
That
it's
plant medicine is big, and that observation. Just
right,
imagine that centuries of time living with that and using that as our only medicine.
right,
Kept us, sustained us.
certainly.
And there's so much strength there for us as knowledge keepers to maintain that. integrity.
Yes, I applaud that effort. And, one in which I must admit, in my use of the English language, we get kind of sloppy, and even in our day-to-day misuse of words, we do not encourage precision in a manner to
Yeah.
make our own self known to one another.
Yeah, it's a very scientific language in a way. Describe the technology that they've developed. But I like using I learned a bit of French, a bit of Spanish, more Romance languages. So even with basic, like this whole English word for excuse me, it seems almost rude when you have to say it, like with people. And I always say excuse-moi, because it just sounds nicer, gracias is very easy. You say thank you. I don't know, I just find some of the European languages a little bit more fluent or just nicer on the ear and not so obtrusive.
Understood. So,
It's a funny little example.
did you make a grand springboard into theater? How did that go?
There was a wonderful man. His name was Jim Buller. He was a Cree from Saskatchewan, opera singer. Became an opera singer in his youth. He died in the 70s, 72. He started this organization in Toronto called AMPHA, Association for Native People in the Performing and Visual Arts, ANDPVA. It became the acronym. And one of the first things he did was to start a theater school for young Native people. And I was around 20 at the time. Had been to Syracuse University. I was studying film studies and photography in Toronto. And I started off as his photographer for a lot of his events. And he must have saw something in me as a performer himself. And he had a British theatrical teacher, well-trained at the LAMDA, London Academy of Music and Dramatic Arts, real fancy school in Britain. He was a recognized Canadian actor, much success. His name was David Calderisi. Jim hired him to teach theater to these like 13 and 14-year-old Anishinaabe or Ojibwe kids. And they were pretty, immature for this highfalutin British theater teacher. And so Jim hired me to go up there and I was like Mother Goose for these little ducklings. And what I learned from David, and that there was a few other teachers there. One was a mime expert. One was kind of a folk singer, guitar player guy, of Jewish descent, I think. He had really curly hair, I remember. But that experience in the theater changed my life. I realized, this is how I impact the world. This is how I can change the world. This is because I realized that my people needed help. And I didn't know how to help. My first instinct was to become a cop or a servant or a guard in a prison, for God's sake. But luckily, when I was going to school stateside here, I ended up at Syracuse for a year. And I was studying at a small community college before that. And that's when Attica happened. And it changed my perspective. I realized, oh, I can't make change from the inside. I have to make change from the outside. And that's when I pursued my career in photography and film production. But then Jim exposed me to the acting experience. And I just never turned back at 20. And it's been 50 years now. That fueled me. And I just was unrelenting. I dedicated my life to the theater. I never did a movie or film thing till 10 years in. I was a stage actor crossing Canada, playing regional theaters, doing, One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest. I don't know how many times I did Chief Bromden, or, I played Lenny a lot in Mice and Men. In different shows. I did some Shakespeare and did contemporary theater. Toronto at the time was a hallmark of independent theatrical development by a bank of wonderful writers. And this one fellow from the University of Western Ontario, James Rainey, recognized that he couldn't tell Canada's history without Native people. And so he enlisted me. He also enlisted Graham Greene, another well-known actor from my community, who we just happened to be related through my grandmother and his father were first cousins. So Graham and I grew up across from each other and then ended up in this rehearsal hall together. Graham looks much more Native than I do, even though we're related. And he grew famed through, being nominated for an Academy Award for Best Supporting Actor for Dances with Wolves. And we were doing a theater piece at the time, back in the late 80s when that film came out. And so that James Rainey was instrumental. He couldn't tell Canada's history without us. And so he incorporated us into his plays. And his plays were very unique because we spent a lot of time workshopping in communities. So we'd come to a community like Dayton, and we'd get a group of interested students or adults, both young and old, and they would tell us the history that they knew of this region. And then we would help them shape a play and then present it back to that community so that they could see their own personal histories and family histories and location histories of, and then we turned it into a play for them. And that work was instrumental in my career. It allowed me to go into my own communities and do that same process of bringing our history and our knowledge keepers to the table and, instructing or writing or developing through improvisation in theatrical plays. And I did that for a number of 10 years of development with new works, new writers, created all these new writers that weren't necessarily just settlers, but Native American, and created one of the best playwrights Canada's ever seen, and a guy named Thompson Highway, Northern Cree from Manitoba. And those plays we did together shook the earth. Most of them became the best play of the year in Canada. And it all transformed from that collective energy of wanting to explore the history of Canada and the relationship with Indigenous people, because we're a big part of that formulation. The French, the English, and the Native history is more entwined in the cultural makeup than the U.S.
Well, it seems that through that real experiential effort,
Exactly.
that sitting, creating theater with the principles
Right.
sort of blossomed and brought a realistic story.
And as the years went by, other writers, settler culture, would take that history and do it almost like Monty Python,
Mhm.
Punch and Judy. It became very prop based, very
Sure.
very big costumes and very erratic and funny. Like we told that history through a sense of humor,
Right.
the history of the formulation of this place. The village of the small huts, they called it. That was the original, the history of the village of the small huts. And it really, those plays still are being performed by the big companies in Toronto and across the land. So the theatrical history of Canada is pretty unique in terms of opening up their minds to the overall history of how this place came to be.
Well, it sounds like the inclusion manner that you do get caught in this us and them finger pointing,
Yeah,
and which seems to be so much a part of the United States, this competitiveness.
yeah. I was just at Penn State University doing much the same for a film festival there. And, you know, that's kind of the hierarchy, you know, as well. They got no native nations, even though my people were there. That was traditional land for the Cayugas in Seneca. And no recognition at all in Penn State about this. And they're just now starting, 2023, starting to socialize the student body that Native America is alive and well, you know. So, you know, better late than never.
Well, my concern is the sustainment generation to
Yeah,
generation.
yeah, they're
The,
set in their ways and they believe what they believe.
and we,
And you can see the Trump culture come out of that, you know, which is like the last bastion of white folk trying to hold on, afraid of this BIPOC growth, world growth of immigration that we've undertaken. A lot of fear mongering, and this country unfortunately has lived by fear mongering the whole time. And it's going to grow up eventually. I mean, it's still a young country compared to everywhere else.
certainly,
But
that's
they're
true.
pretty immature about its you know, ability to kind of mature,
Well,
and they're still kind of ruling the world under these
there,
this premise, and it's getting to the point where it's dangerous.
well, certainly. And
Yeah,
and again, I want you to speak from your perspective. Mine is one of, we have scarred so much.
I wish Americans knew what they did in Central America.
Uh,
They don't understand what's happening in South America now, how the impact of the, you know, the business model or the corporation,
it's-
what they're doing around the world is I've known this for a long time because I've told a lot of those stories. I've gone up the Rio Coco River between Nicaragua and El Salvador. I saw what happened when the Sandinista War was going on. All the churches supported the Sandinista, and they were basically wiping out the Mosquito Indians, you know, starving them to death and torturing them. That was like 1980. So when you think the French invaded us 1605 in northern New York, Victor, New York came in, first time we ever met an enemy. They couldn't beat us, you know, through army, so they burned our food. You know, we never met an enemy to burn out your food, try to starve you out. So they're still doing that in Nicaragua in 1989, you know, 1985, that war there. So not much has changed in those 500 years, you know.
no,
So that's disheartening. It's hard to, you know, to be so cooperative. And it's only through my artistic nature that I've been able to battle that. Predecessors to me, the American Indian movement, tried to do it otherwise, but we realized soon after they infiltrated when we burnt the American flag on the steps of the Bureau of Indian Affairs, and everything changed. became a Shakespeare play. We got invaded by Secret Service, FBI, you name it, CIA, and they did everything to. It's like a Shakespearean play. It's like the fall of Othello, and they just undermined it and infiltrated and turned us. It's always been turn us against each other. That's been the rule of order. They're very good at that and still do that around the world now. Turning people on each other, keep the struggle internal while they're just stripping the place of every mineral, every possible resource that's available and needed by them for whatever science they live by, which is not by natural science for sure.
Well, you have graciously given so much in this interview and there's never a final word because
No, it's still ongoing.
yes,
It's more present now for young people than ever before, though. There's more knowledge now once the internet exploded, and the knowledge is available to everyone now to re-socialize yourself to the truth at some level.
and people
History.
like yourself who are living amongst us,
Yeah.
willing to courageously come to Dayton, Ohio, to other areas and express and allow the stories that you have experienced and have learned from.
No, it's important work. I'm happy to be here in Ohio, trying to, do whatever I can to open people's eyes. That's my role. Whether I'm on screen or in person or however I can do it, that's how I survive.
I would ask you to perhaps give a word of encouragement. I know that you mentioned a film festival here, possibly as a means and a method.
Public radio has always been my advocate, because people support public radio by financial donation. NPR has been sidewinded for a long time through corporate support. Even CBC, the Canadian Broadcasting Corporation, has been kind of bought out. It's hard to get our story to the general public. And it's through that public radio system, which Reagan almost killed. He gave radio to the corporations and religious sects, but indigenous voices are only heard, for the most part, on local community-based radio, local community-based television. That's always been my experience, and I always honor the work volunteers like yourself to bring some truth to the life of Americans and Canadians alike, to their own history in a way. And they're a part of us. Now, we're all part of one. And there's less lines than ever before. So, I'm more encouraged by that, but I wish there was more opportunity for broadcast in America. Currently, there's only maybe 40 nonprofit radio operators in over 600 communities in America of Native people, 600 reservations. We got 40 radio stations on res, most of those controlled by the nation and their politics, because sometimes nations get bought out by some degradator of some mineral, and they don't want their nation to understand. So if you can actually think that there is no free press in a Native community, and there's very few free press left in the American community generally. So truth is hard to come by. It's really hard to find, honest, informed with no political attachments because you can't say this because my father works there. You know, everyone's in on the big dark. And we're all living in the darkness. So, you know, bringing light is the best I can do any way I can. But I found a lot of support with community-based, journalism.
Well, on behalf of the community here, I am so grateful. And it was your outreach, just our casual meeting, that you looked at my name tag.
Yeah.
It's all community. I am a big believer in community.
Yeah.
And,
That's how we sustain.
and
Yeah.
we can not do it by ourselves. There's not a them or us.
Yeah.
We do not need to have this sort of irritated personality and
Yeah.
constantly at each other's throat.
It's more obvious than ever that we have to sustain our community, and everything we need to survive has to come within that 100-mile radius. We can no longer bring, we have to find a way to sustain what our needs are within that 100-mile radius. Because we won't sustain, we can't sustain anything outside of that. We can't afford to bring oranges up from Mexico anymore, and all those transportation and fuel and different things. We have to learn how to live within that 100-mile radius. And that's classic community. It's the only thing that's going to sustain America are the communities themselves, and them bonding and learning from each other how to sustain forever.